It is the night of 23rd October, 1942, and the western desert is holding its breath. Along a stretch of featureless sand near a railway halt called El Alamein, nearly 1,000 British guns stand ready, their crews crouched in silence, watches synchronized to the second. 12 kilometers behind them, in the darkness of a supply dump that should not exist, several hundred lorries sit parked in neat rows. Except they are not lorries at all. Beneath a canvas and timber frame, designed to mimic the silhouette of a 3-ton truck, sits a Grant tank, its gun barrel folded away, its engine silent, waiting for the order to shed its disguise and roll forward into battle. A few kilometers to the south, an entire dummy pipeline snakes across the desert floor, complete with fake pumping stations and dummy water tanks, built slowly enough and convincingly enough that German reconnaissance aircraft have been photographing its progress for weeks. To the enemy studying those photographs in Berlin and in Rommel's headquarters at Smithers, the picture is unmistakable. The British attack is coming from the south, and it is not coming yet. Both conclusions are wrong, and both are about to cost the Axis dearly. This is the story of one of the strangest and most successful acts of large-scale deception in military history. An operation in which British camouflage officers, artists, and engineers built an entire phantom army out of canvas, wood, and imagination, and used it to help win the battle that Winston Churchill would later call the turning point of the war. It is a story with no explosions in its opening act, no gunfire, no drama in the conventional sense. Instead, it is a story about sand, shadows, and the exploitation of a very human weakness, the tendency to believe what we expect to see. What follows explains why the British Army found itself needing to lie to an entire enemy force with nothing but props. Why the solution required scientists and stage designers working side by side with soldiers, and why the deception worked so completely that Erwin Rommel, one of the most gifted commanders of the war, positioned his forces in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. By the autumn of 1942, the war in North Africa had become a brutal stalemate, written in sand and blood. For nearly 2 years, British and Commonwealth forces had traded the initiative back and forth with the Italian and German forces of the Panzerarmee Africa, sweeping hundreds of kilometers east and west across Libya and Egypt as supply lines lengthened and armies exhausted themselves. Rommel, the so-called Desert Fox, had pushed the British 8th Army back to within roughly 100 kilometers of Alexandria by the summer, a retreat so alarming that contingency plans were being drawn up for the defense of the Suez Canal itself. The stakes were not abstract. Control of the canal meant control of Britain's supply route to India and the Far East, and a German breakthrough at Alamein threatened to sever it entirely. General Bernard Montgomery, newly appointed to command the 8th Army in August 1942, inherited a force that had the numbers and the equipment to win, but faced a specific and daunting tactical problem. The terrain at El Alamein was a narrow 40-kilometer corridor bounded by the Mediterranean to the north and the impassable Qattara Depression to the south, which meant there was no way to outflank the enemy, as had happened so often earlier in the desert campaign. Any attack would have to be a frontal one, against prepared German and Italian positions studded with minefields the soldiers grimly nicknamed the Devil's Gardens. Montgomery knew that surprise was nearly impossible to achieve through concealment alone in open desert, where dust clouds and unit movements were visible to aerial reconnaissance for kilometers in every direction. Rommel's own intelligence service and the German Luftwaffe's reconnaissance squadrons had become highly skilled at reading exactly these signs, and previous British attacks in the desert had frequently been anticipated because of exactly this kind of exposure. The particular challenge facing Montgomery's staff was not simply hiding an attack, but redirecting an enemy's attention entirely. Simply concealing preparations was not enough, because absence of information invites an enemy to guess correctly, as often as incorrectly. What was needed was a false picture so complete and so convincing that German commanders would draw the wrong conclusion with confidence, committing their limited reserves, particularly their mobile panzer divisions, to defend the wrong sector when the real blow fell. Montgomery's planned assault, codenamed Operation Lightfoot, would strike in the north along the coast, spearheaded by a colossal artillery barrage and an infantry assault through the minefields, opening a corridor for armor to pour through. For that plan to succeed, Rommel's armored reserves needed to be sitting uselessly in the south when the guns opened up, 30 kilometers from where they were needed. Achieving that required Britain's deception planners to answer an almost impossible question. How do you convince a skilled and suspicious enemy commander to move his most powerful weapon exactly where you want it, using nothing but appearances? The man tasked with engineering this illusion was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Richardson, Montgomery's chief of staff for deception, working alongside a remarkable camouflage expert named Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Barkas, who had been a film director before the war, and Major Jasper Maskelyne, drawn from a family of celebrated stage magicians and illusionists. The operation they devised was named Operation Bertram, and its brilliance lay not in any single device, but in an entire ecosystem of deception, built and maintained over roughly 6 weeks by engineers, camouflage units, and thousands of ordinary soldiers pressed into service as set builders. At the heart of Bertram sat 2 ingenious pieces of equipment. The first was known as the Sunshield, a lightweight, collapsible framework of tubular steel and canvas that could be fitted over a real tank to disguise it as an innocuous 3-ton lorry. A crew of 2 could erect a Sunshield over a Grant or Crusader tank in a matter of minutes, and just as quickly collapse it and stow it away before going into action, transforming what German reconnaissance photographs showed as a harmless supply convoy into an armored strike force the moment battle began. The second device, the Cannibal, worked in the opposite direction, using a light frame to disguise an ordinary lorry as a tank, useful for populating dummy formations with vehicles that could genuinely move under their own power and kick up authentic-looking dust trails, rather than relying purely on static models. To scale this deception up to army level, camouflage units built entire dummy formations from scratch. Thousands of dummy tanks, guns and vehicles, some full-sized wooden and canvas mock-ups so light that 4 men could carry one into position, were arrayed in the southern sector to suggest a massing armored force preparing to attack from there, precisely where Montgomery did not intend to strike. Meanwhile, in the northern sector where the real assault would launch, roughly 1,000 genuine tanks, guns, and thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel had to be moved into position and hidden in plain sight, disguised as the mundane clutter of a static, unthreatening supply area. Real artillery pieces were driven into dug-in positions and covered with sheets designed to mimic the profile of parked lorries. Ammunition dumps large enough to support a major offensive were built to visually resemble small, insignificant stores, using stacking patterns and camouflage netting, refined through painstaking trial and aerial photographic analysis by Britain's own reconnaissance flights, who checked their own handiwork from the air exactly as German pilots would. Perhaps the single most audacious element of Operation Bertram was the fake water pipeline. Deception planners calculated that Rommel's staff, applying ordinary military logic, would assume that any large-scale attack required an adequate water supply, and that building a real pipeline capable of supporting an offensive would take a predictable amount of time, giving away both the location and the earliest possible date of an assault. So British engineers built a pipeline that led precisely nowhere, running south towards the supposed staging area, its construction rate deliberately calibrated. Sections of pipe, real cast-off materials reused for the purpose, were laid at a pace of roughly 8 kilometers per day, but built using empty petrol cans linked together to mimic the appearance of pipe sections from the air. Dummy pump houses were erected at intervals, and the entire structure was left half-finished on a schedule engineered to suggest completion, and thus a plausible attack date, several days after Montgomery actually intended to strike. It was a lie built not from concealment, but from a false sense of time itself, exploiting the enemy's own careful, rational analysis against him. The deception even extended to sound and movement. Genuine vehicle tracks were bulldozed into the sand across the southern sector to simulate the wear patterns of a massing force, while real tank tracks in the north were swept away or disguised each night. Dummy figures and even simulated radio traffic, mimicking the chatter of entire divisions that did not exist in that location, were used to thicken the illusion for any listening post intercepting the airwaves. Every element reinforced every other, so that a German analyst cross-referencing aerial photography, ground reconnaissance, and signals intelligence would find them all telling the same false story. When Operation Lightfoot opened at 9:40 p.m. on October 23rd, 1942, with a barrage from more than 900 guns, the deception had already done its work. Rommel himself was absent in Germany for medical treatment, and his stand-in commander, General Georg Stumme, and the forces under him had oriented significant armored reserves towards the southern sector in anticipation of an attack that was never coming from there. Accounts from German staff officers after the battle described genuine confusion in the opening hours about where the main British effort actually lay, a confusion that cost precious time in redirecting the Panzer divisions northward, time the attacking British and Commonwealth infantry used to fight their way through the minefields. Stumme died of a heart attack while touring the front on the second day of the battle, adding further disruption to German command at the critical moment. Documentation of exactly how much the deception alone, as opposed to the sheer weight of British material superiority, shaped Axis decision-making in those first confused days, remains a matter of historical debate, and no serious historian claims Bertram alone won the battle. What is well documented is that German assessments of British intentions before the battle were substantially wrong, and that the delay in committing armored reserves to the correct sector materially assisted the 8th Army's breakthrough in the north. The human cost of maintaining this illusion should not be understated. Building and servicing the dummy formations in the south was grueling, unglamorous work, carried out under a punishing desert sun by ordinary soldiers who had been temporarily converted into set builders and stagehands. Dummy vehicles needed constant maintenance, since desert winds could collapse a canvas tank overnight, or shift a carefully positioned dummy gun just enough to break the pattern an aerial photograph was meant to confirm. Camouflage officers walked the lines each morning, checking shadows, since a dummy tank that cast the wrong shadow at the wrong hour could undo weeks of careful work in a single reconnaissance pass. Even something as small as vehicle spacing mattered, because real armored formations parked according to well-understood doctrine, and German analysts, some of whom had studied at the same pre-war military academies as their British counterparts, knew exactly what a genuine tank park was meant to look like. Getting the fake wrong in a way that a trained eye would notice was almost as dangerous as no deception at all, since a botched illusion can alert an enemy to the very thing it was meant to hide. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more to this story still to come. It is worth placing Bertram alongside the deception efforts of Britain's adversaries and allies to understand just how far ahead of its time it was. German forces in North Africa employed camouflage and dummy positions of their own throughout the Desert War, and Rommel was himself an experienced practitioner of using dust and feints to disguise the size of his forces during earlier offensives. But nothing on the German side approached the scale, coordination, and sheer organizational commitment of Bertram, which drew on dedicated camouflage development units, professional illusionists, and the full resources of an army staff working weeks in advance. The Soviet Union, fighting on a vastly larger front, developed its own tradition of large-scale deception known as maskirovka, and would go on to use dummy armor and false radio traffic to devastating effect ahead of operations such as the encirclement at Stalingrad, though these efforts developed largely in parallel with, rather than directly copying, British desert techniques. The most direct successor to Bertram's philosophy came 2 years later in the form of the American 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, popularly remembered as the Ghost Army, which used inflatable tanks, sound trucks broadcasting recordings of armored columns, and fake radio traffic across the European theater following the D-Day landings. British deception planners who had cut their teeth in the desert, including some who worked directly on Bertram, went on to shape the far larger and more famous Operation Fortitude, the fictional army group conjured up in southeast England to convince German intelligence that the main Allied invasion would fall at Calais rather than Normandy, where Bertram fooled a single army commander over roughly 40 kilometers of desert. Fortitude aimed to fool an entire German high command about the fate of a continent, a direct scaling up of lessons first tested with canvas and steel tubing in the sand outside El Alamein. The material legacy of El Alamein is well known. It halted the westward retreat of the Eighth Army for good, opened the way for the advance into Tunisia, and gave Britain, in Churchill's own words, its first great land victory of the war after years of retreat and disappointment. What is less widely appreciated is how much of that victory depended on convincing an enemy commander to believe something false with total confidence, rather than simply leaving him uncertain. Deception of this kind is notoriously difficult to measure with precision. Historians generally agree that Bertram significantly delayed and confused the German response in the battle's crucial opening phase, even as they caution against attributing the entire victory to deception rather than to the underlying British advantages in men, tanks, aircraft, and supplies. Advantages that had been steadily built up specifically for this battle. The psychological dimension may in the end matter as much as the material one. An enemy who believes he understands his opponent's plan commits his reserves decisively and without hesitation, while an enemy left merely uncertain tends to hedge. And hedging, in the crucial early hours of a major offensive, can itself be fatal. Bertram did not leave Rommel's forces uncertain. It left them certain and wrong, which is arguably a far more dangerous condition to induce in an opponent. The techniques pioneered at Alamein, from the sun-shield tank disguise to the false pipeline, fed directly into the doctrine that would underpin fortitude and the broader Allied deception effort ahead of the Normandy landings, arguably one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the 20th century. Surviving examples of desert camouflage equipment and photographs documenting the dummy formations can today be seen in the collections of the Imperial War Museum in London, alongside archival aerial reconnaissance images that show, with a strange kind of pride, just how convincing the illusion still looks more than 80 years on. There is also a quieter legacy worth noting, one that has less to do with tanks and pipelines than with how militaries think. Before Alamein, deception in the Desert War had largely been improvised, a clever officer's trick deployed here and there as circumstances allowed. Bertram demonstrated that deception could instead be planned, with the same rigor, the same dedicated staff, and the same long lead time as any other major military operation, treated not as a sideshow, but as a weapon system in its own right, with its own specialists, its own supply chain of timber and canvas, and its own chain of command. That institutional lesson proved every bit as influential as any individual device, shaping the way Britain and its allies would organize deception for the remainder of the war and beyond. Return for a moment to that October night, to the guns standing silent in the dark and the dummy lorries parked in careful rows that were never lorries at all. Somewhere behind German lines, an intelligence officer studies his photographs and his reports and reaches a confident, considered, entirely rational conclusion. And that conclusion is a lie built from tubular steel, painted canvas, and empty petrol tins laid end to end across the desert floor. There were no gods of war deceived that night, only tired men doing careful work, reading maps that other tired men had spent 6 weeks quietly falsifying. What Operation Bertram achieved was not a single trick, but an entire false world, layered and cross-referenced, until it became more convincing than the truth it was built to hide. A pipeline that led nowhere convinced an army of where and when. A canvas frame turned death into cargo, and cargo into death at the flick of a crew's hands. Dummy guns held a flank that never needed holding, because the enemy who might have tested it had already been persuaded to look elsewhere. This was Britain's insane, magnificent bluff, played not against a gullible amateur, but against one of the most capable field commanders Germany produced. And it worked. It worked because the illusion was patient, because it was consistent across every source an enemy might check, and because it exploited not stupidity, but reason itself, the perfectly sensible human habit of believing your own careful analysis of the evidence in front of you. Rommel's forces did not lose the initial battle of position because they were foolish. They lost it because they were shown a world that did not exist, and they trusted their own eyes. In the end, the desert kept few secrets and told few lies of its own. But for 6 extraordinary weeks in the autumn of 1942, a handful of British officers, artists, and engineers made it tell one enormous lie on their behalf. And an empire's fortunes in North Africa turned, in no small part, on canvas, steel tubing, and sand.